Well, good afternoon. Why don't we go ahead and get started? My name is Suhail Khan, and I'll be serving as your moderator today for the panel discussion that's entitled Coalition Building, Organizing and Mobilizing in the Post-9/11 Era. We have a action-packed, fun-filled discussion, especially since it's after lunch, and I know a lot of folks are starting to get a little drowsy, but we'll try to keep the discussion very lively. It is obviously a very important subject, and not to make light of some of the challenges that we face as a country looking backward and then also going forward as to where we hope to go as both individuals, as Americans, but really as a national community in this country. So we have three very special panelists that are here to join us to discuss coalition building in the post-9/11 era. And first off, we're joined with Margaret Huang, who's the Executive Director of the Rights Working Group. And then to her left, we're joined by Suehaila Amen, who's the first Vice President and Communications and Public Relations Chair of the Lebanese American Heritage Club out of Dearborn, Michigan. And then finally, to the far left, we have Khaled Beydoun, who's also an attorney and an advocate. And what I thought we would do is have each of them speak for a few minutes and share their thoughts about where we've come in this arena of coalition building since 9/11, since the 9/11 tragedy, some of the challenges that we've faced as a community, some of the successes that we've been able to achieve both on the grassroots and the national level, and then look at kind of where we are now, 10 years later, and assess where we are, again, as a community, as a country, some of the challenges that we continue to face, some of the new challenges that might be arising as we look forward, and then what are some of the opportunities and positive opportunities out there that might be ways that we can continue to make success and really do a better job of telling our story. And what I thought I would do before I turn it over to Margaret is just set the stage a little bit, looking back perhaps for a little bit from a personal experience on my part. I came here, like a lot of staffers in Washington, D.C., very idealistic out of law school, almost 16 years ago to serve my hometown congressman from Northern California. And like a lot of you in the audience and a lot of folks watching, you know, my first brush with politics was Schoolhouse Rock as a 5- and 6-year-old on Saturday and Sunday mornings, watching TV where you saw the little rolled-up bill, singing about how he wants to become a law. And just really the American process of constituents going to their elected officials with a grievance, petitioning their elected officials, asking for a law to be passed to stop something or to make something happen or to put a stop sign on a street corner or a signal light or whatever it might be. And then that process, that democratic process with all its bumps and hurdles and stops and goings-ons. And I was very interested by that. And so when I got older and went to college and studied political science and then subsequently the law, I thought to myself, why not go to where those laws are made, just like in that after-school Schoolhouse Rock cartoon, Capitol Hill, and be a part of the system of our American democracy where laws are made and where we hope that we make laws that would benefit our country and our fellow Americans. Several years later, I had the opportunity to serve in the White House under President Bush, and on that Tuesday morning, ironically, when I was preparing a memo for the president for his first meeting with major Arab and Muslim leaders that afternoon, the alarms went off and we were told that a jetliner was headed towards the White House, that a jetliner had crashed into the World Trade Center. It wasn't clear whether this was an accident or this was deliberate, but soon enough, the Secret Service and other law enforcement officers realized that this was a deliberate attack on our country and that not only had we lost several, at that point, an unknown number of fellow Americans, but there were possibly other losses of human life in our country, and we didn't know to the extent of the attack and how many attacks there would be in places like New York, in Virginia, and in Washington, D.C. And so really, for me and for so many thousands and millions around this city and the country, our lives changed with the 9/11 tragedy. And it's continued to change since then in the 10 years after, whether it's Arab Americans and Muslims living in places like Dearborn or Toledo or in Orange County, California, or for lawmakers here in Washington, D.C., tackling challenges regarding our national security, immigration, civil liberties, and law enforcement, or even for the particular communities that are affected, whether they are Muslim or Arab or perceived to be Muslim or Arab, like South Asians and others. There are ongoing challenges. I'm confident with these challenges that there will be a happy ending, and there really is no ending. As you know, the story is ongoing. But while there have been challenges of civil rights violations, of government scrutiny, sometimes unfair, sometimes unwarranted, of political rhetoric that unfortunately has spiked, and I want to hopefully talk about that with our panelists, why we're seeing anti-Muslim, anti-Arab hostility spike now, 10 years later. Why do poll after poll reflect that suspicion, fear, and hatred towards Arab American and Muslim Americans is now at an all-time high, much higher than it was even days after the attacks on 9/11 10 years ago. And I'm curious, and I've been curious as to why that phenomenon has been occurring, and I would like to discuss that with the panelists, as some of the reasons why that's occurring and perhaps some of the ways that we can tackle some of those ongoing challenges. And then really to look to other communities, since this topic is coalition building. How can we as Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, build coalitions with our fellow Americans to meet those challenges? And to really look to other communities who have, for better or worse, really seen this movie before, whether it was African Americans, Jewish Americans, Catholics, whether Italian or Irish, Japanese Americans during World War II and their internment and legalized discrimination, and most recently even during the Red Scare and before, the hostility towards Jewish Americans around our country, and to look to those communities for their experiences and for really their secrets, or if not so secret, but their ways of dealing with these challenges to overcome those challenges. We are, as picking up on the last panel, there was a question as to whether we are an exceptional country. I, for one, feel that we are, because there is something called the American dream. It's an ongoing and evolving dream. From many come one. I think that we're continuing to try to really reach those goals and to achieve those goals. But as I said earlier, the story doesn't necessarily end, but we are at a very important time 10 years after 9/11. And so I thought we would have a very good discussion and presentation from the panelists very briefly, and then we'll have a discussion amongst ourselves and then the audience, and hopefully come away with a positive action plan as to how we might, as individuals and as a community, move forward in bettering our country for the better. So I'll start off with Margaret, and then we'll go from there.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a quiet group. Let's try it again. Good afternoon, everyone. Great, thank you very much. I'd like to thank ADC and particularly Abid for inviting me to join the panel today. It's really an honor to be here and to be part of this discussion with all of you. I'm going to speak a little bit about the coalition that I represent, the Rights Working Group, which in fact was formed out of 9/11, and more particularly the backlash against civil liberties and human rights in this country after 9/11. It started as a fairly small Inside the Beltway initiative. There were a few dozen groups that got together and said, we're all dealing with new national security policies, expanded use of existing policies, and they're targeting our communities. We have to figure out a way to work together. And we ought to be able to share information and collaborate in new ways to try to change these policies. And a number of the groups worked on a piece of legislation that was introduced in 2004 called the Civil Liberties Restoration Act. Unfortunately, it went nowhere fast. And I think the realization of the groups at that time was that it really can't be an inside the Beltway strategy. This is about changing a national conversation. This is about engaging constituencies across the country in the struggle. And so Rights Working Group shifted gears, and we started doing outreach to community organizations around the country. Today, we have more than 320 member organizations from around the country, many of whom are small, grassroots-led, often completely volunteer-staffed, but they are all committed to the principles that we laid out from the beginning, which is to combat things like the violations of human rights caused by the Patriot Act, what happened with NSEERS, the National Security Entry-Exit Registration System. And most recently, in 2009, we launched a new campaign called Racial Profiling: Face the Truth. The Face the Truth campaign was explicitly designed to achieve 3 policy goals. The first is to actually enact federal legislation that would prohibit all racial profiling by all law enforcement agencies at the state, local, and federal levels, and on the basis, using as the definition of racial profiling on the basis of race, national origin, ethnicity, and religion. So it would really fundamentally change the way a lot of people have conceptualized racial profiling in this country. A second policy goal of the campaign was to try to get the Department of Justice to make a few important fixes to the 2003 guidance on the use of race by federal law enforcement agencies. Essentially, that guidance that was adopted by then Attorney General Ashcroft told federal law enforcement agencies that they couldn't use racial profiling, but it included a number of really important exceptions or loopholes. So for example, federal law enforcement agencies were allowed to use racial profiling in the name of national security. They were also allowed to use racial profiling in the context of border security. And most importantly, it was unenforceable and didn't apply to state and local law enforcement, which is where many of the problems of racial profiling actually occur. So our second policy goal was to try to get those loopholes fixed and to make the guidance stronger and enforceable. A third policy goal was to actually target the Department of Homeland Security and to stop the collaboration between local police and federal agencies in immigration enforcement. As many of you probably know, there's been a dramatic increase in the role of local police in enforcing immigration laws. This has been spurred by state laws, such as the ones in Arizona, Georgia, South Carolina, the list goes on. A number of states have adopted legislation that require their police to ask about people's immigration or citizenship status when they come into contact with local police. But this has been a longer history than just those recent laws. And in fact, the Department of Homeland Security has a number of programs that either encourage formal official relationships between local police and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, or in fact facilitate that collaboration in ways that have in fact led to racial profiling in many different communities around the country. But I think the most important goal of our campaign actually didn't have to do with policy changes, which is a good thing because we're not having that much success so far on the policy side. The most important goal was to actually get all of the targeted communities affected by racial profiling to work together on the campaign. So as you might imagine, racial profiling, as has been said, is not a new issue. It's been around for a long time. And we have a lot of things to learn from the African American community, from the Latino community, from other communities. But these communities were not working together on the legislation or any of these policy goals. So one of the things we did is last year in 2010, we held a series of field hearings around the country. And we asked each community that hosted a field hearing to invite people from all of the communities that have been targeted by racial profiling: African Americans, Latinos, Asians, Muslims, Arabs, South Asians, many other immigrant communities, to come and give testimony about how they've been affected. Some of them had been personally racially profiled. Others were in cars or walking with their family members or friends and witnessed racial profiling. And the impact was really quite amazing to hear in the personal testimonies, which were documented, but also to see the commonalities. And I think for many in the room, it was the first time that they realized that people of other communities had shared that very embarrassing, shameful, frustrating, aggravating experience that they had as well. So we put out a report. I brought a copy, but you can download it from our website as well, called Faces of Racial Profiling. And this report actually includes a lot of the testimonies that we collected in the different places where the hearings were held, including Michigan was one of those places. And we worked with ADC and others to organize that one. But we also wanted people to take away from this a sense of the need to work together. This year, in fact, next week, we are putting out a new report, and this report is called Reclaiming Our Rights. You're the first ones to see it. It hasn't been released officially yet. And we're actually doing a press conference next week, hopefully with Congressman Conyers, and Senator Cardin will be there, the two sponsors of the End Racial Profiling Act this year. And a number of the authors of the report, including Laura Murphy, who just did the lunch here, and a number of others, Karen Narasaki, who talked about the Japanese internment experience of her family during World War II. And this report looks at the last 10 years. All of these people have been working on the problem of racial profiling for the last 10 years. What's happened? What experiences have people had that have made this struggle harder, or perhaps given them more hope that by working together in different communities, we can actually make a difference happen? So next week, you can get a copy of this from our website. So in thinking about where we go next, what are the challenges for coalition building and working on issues like racial profiling and other post-9/11 civil liberties problems? First, we really have to mobilize our communities to demand the change. It's not enough for professional advocates like those of us in the room, and myself included, to be leading the charge on this, but in fact, we need voices of people who've been affected by this to be joining us. And it's really their initiative and effort and enthusiasm and passion that's going to help us persuade people in this administration and any other administration of the importance of this issue. Second, we really have to change the political debate. A lot's happened in the last 10 years. There have been numbers of public polls that have showed that the United States public absolutely is against the problem of racial profiling. Nobody thinks it's a good idea. But now, since 9/11, people have started making exceptions. Well, we know it doesn't work, and we know it's a violation of the law, but maybe it's okay when I'm getting on an airplane that they're checking the people who look like they might be terrorists. So that's the kind of response people are getting now. Racial profiling is bad except in certain circumstances, and once you open the door for accepting that racial profiling might work in some circumstances, then we're all at risk. Thanks. So we have to change that political discourse. And I think it's really important to think about who the messengers are. And that's, again, where the importance of coalition building comes in. It's important that people from different communities are supportive of one another in fighting these challenges. And so along those lines is my third thought about where we need to go next. We have to support our allies in their struggles when we're asking them to support ours. When the African American community is concerned about high rates of incarceration and the impact on young Black men in their communities, our communities should be advocating and organizing with them. When the Latino community is concerned about racial profiling by police and being asked for their papers and to prove that they're here in this country with status, we should be supporting them in their organizing and advocacy efforts. And when we find out that the CIA and the FBI have been spying on mosques along with the local police, we should be asking our friends in those communities to come out and organize and protest with us. It's really important that we support all of the struggles equally. We can't ask for support on our fights when we haven't made the effort to support others. And so I think that's an absolutely essential part of our work. The last thing I wanted to say before I wrap up, I hope a number of you might have listened to the NPR story this morning on the Mall of America security problems. Recently, NPR did a big investigation of the way that the Mall of America has been monitoring suspicious activity in that mall. Are you all familiar with the Mall of America, a big mall in Minneapolis, I think, right? So the security guards have been participating in a Department of Homeland Security program called Suspicious Activity Reporting. And they take reports of things that they think look suspicious. So for example, if somebody is sitting down and writing a list, that could be suspicious. If somebody is taking a picture in the mall, that could be suspicious. As it turns out, when NPR reviewed the list of recent suspicious activity reports documented by security guards at the Mall of America, more than 2/3 of the people on the list were people of color. African Americans, Latinos, Arabs, Muslims, South Asians, it's all of our communities. So until we start working together on the question of what makes somebody suspicious, it's not writing a list on a piece of paper. I think everybody who goes to a mall probably writes a list on a piece of paper. It is who is writing the list. And until we work together to combat that notion, we're not going to succeed. Thanks.
Thank you, Margaret. Next up, I want to invite Suehaila Amen from Dearborn to come and share her thoughts.
Thank you, Suhail. And I'd like to thank ADC and Abed Ayoub, who's a dear friend, someone I grew up with and have known since I was a little girl. I was a very active member of ADC for a good 10 years, coming to DC quite often. just a brief background, I'm coming from a completely different perspective than my fellow panelists. I come from the grassroots end of things, where coming from a city like Dearborn, community organizing, you face great challenges in trying to pull together the Muslim and Arab American community in Metro Detroit. Post 9/11, things changed dramatically for our communities. So this is something that has been in the forefront for many of us on the grassroots level. You have to begin organizing at home in your hometowns before you can take it to a national level, and have the pleasure of working with people like Margaret and Suhail and Khaled. So on my end, I just wanted to touch base on some of the things that I feel that communities were looking at prior to 9/11. I remember working, prior to 10 years ago, 15 years ago, our focus was on foreign policy, how we were concerned with the issues that we were facing on a foreign level, as opposed to dealing with things domestically. There was more of a focus on the Middle East, on the Palestine-Israel issue, immigration policies and procedures, and helping people get political asylum to flee the nations that they were living in, and dealing with their own suffering. There was a lot of humanitarian aid work being done at that time. Our focus in terms of media was to dispel misconceptions and stereotypes in the film industry, and helping media outlets deal better with our Arab and Muslim American community on a completely different level than what we're dealing with now post 9/11. There was a great push for civic participation prior to 9/11. Since 9/11 happened, and I think we all understand it's a tragedy that affected every single person, I don't believe just in this nation, but around the world. It's something that made us more aware to take a look at who we are and how we're going to be affected by this tragedy. The focus shifted on community organizing to things pertaining to domestic policies, where our foreign policies took a back seat for us at this point. We weren't as concerned with how we were going to move forward on dealing with issues in the Middle East, but now we're more focused on what was going on in the United States, how we were going to be affected by domestic policy, but how our civil liberties were going to possibly be affected and infringed upon, and what we were going to face in terms of national security. In terms of immigration, what we were more concerned about prior to 9/11 was the focus on how do we get our families here, making the policies and procedures easy to bring in relatives from overseas, and to make their transition into the United States an easy one. Whereas now we're facing deportation and detainment, and finding that secret evidence is being used, and how are we going to save our community members from being shipped out without a moment's notice. People being taken in the middle of the night for a crime that was possibly committed 25 years ago, as a case that we faced. I know ADC Michigan had worked on several years back, who was actually my father's first cousin. When he was 20 years old, had possession of marijuana charge, and should have voluntarily deported himself 25 years ago. But after he, at the time, was a new immigrant, didn't really understand the laws, didn't understand what voluntarily deporting yourself was or meant, and that he should have gotten on a plane and left, had stayed, had a family, opened businesses, was paying his taxes, living just as any other American citizen, had never received a ticket, never was in trouble with the law, went on to become a very fruitful citizen. And 5 o'clock in the morning, door is, broken down, and he's taken and on the next plane back overseas to a country that he hadn't lived in over 25 years. So these are issues that we were now facing, is how do we protect the people who have been outstanding citizens and done their job to participate in the system in this nation and protect their civil liberties. We then began to face issues with the war on terror, and our concern towards dealing with media then went from how do we deal with the misconceptions and stereotypes of people in film, in the film industry and in movies where you always see the Arab wrapped in his garb, on his camel riding through a desert, and now dealing with the fact that we were being stereotyped in every aspect of media, in the news, in informational films, and really any and everything that was coming across through the television and the internet. So that was a much greater effort that we had to now focus on. And it was something that was depleting not only our resources, but all of our energy. For myself, a lot of the people like me in the community work on a volunteer basis. We don't work as employees of these organizations. We work strictly on a volunteer basis, putting in our personal time, effort, and at times our own personal funds to forward these initiatives and to encourage our community members to speak out and to reach out to other organizations. Our push was greatly on civic participation and getting people involved, because at this point people realized that, well, I'm an Arab and I'm a Muslim post 9/11, nobody wants to hear what I have to say. My voice doesn't matter, because people felt that their civil liberties were being infringed upon. And it took us much time and difficulty in reaching out to the grassroots community, especially from an immigrant community who doesn't understand that there were communities that came before us that suffered the same persecutions in this nation, that Japanese Americans went through it. They all understand the civil rights movement in the 60s, but they don't know what happened to others who came to this country and immigrated here and faced the same issues that we're facing today. So that took much effort, and is still taking that effort to open up their eyes and help them to understand. A huge focus on a grassroots level is to build, in coalition building, is to build relationships with organizations such as the ACLU, such as the NAACP, and organizations such as ADC on a national level. It's important for us to have these connections with these organizations and agencies, and in terms walking that very fine line of being an ally with government agencies while still maintaining that level of open criticism as well, because it's a very fine line in working with a grassroots community that doesn't understand that you need to have these relationships in order to further your agenda and to advance as a community in dealing with these issues. So hopefully, in being here, I'll be able to address that end of things, because it is coming from a completely different angle than what people deal with on a national level. So thank you for allowing me here today.
Thank you, Suhaila. And finally, but not least, we're joined with Khaled Beydoun.
Okay, I had a nice fancy speech prepared, but I thought that given the significance of the weight of the day today, that I'd speak more from reflection and more from kind of remembering the events of the past decade and so forth. And I threw away that speech, so bear with me if there's some unconventional stops and interruptions and obstacles during the presentation. But earlier today, I had a chance to speak to a former law school friend by the name of Sergio Perez, who attended the UCLA School of Law with me, and we both reflected upon the day. And I'm sure many of you can vividly remember the days and the events that unfolded on 9/11, and more specifically where you were. Him and I spoke at length about that day, given that it was our second week of law school. It was an interesting existential experience for me, given that I was moving from the Midwest in Detroit to Los Angeles and not really having a community, not having friends, and being forced to adjust to a completely different context at a very critical and very trying and volatile time, not only in my life, but also in the history of this country. In reflecting at the time, if I can kind of paint the landscape for you, the University of California at large was experiencing a post-affirmative action landscape where diversity on campus was virtually non-existent. Our law school class had 9 African Americans. Latino Americans were, I think, 45 or 50, which is especially a travesty given the location of UCLA in Los Angeles, being, the hub, if not the capital of Chicano America and Spanish-speaking America. But we reflected on that day, and I was one of 3 Arab Americans at the UCLA School of Law, and perhaps the only conspicuous and self-identifying Arab American post 9/11. And at the UCLA School of Law, I had no platform as an Arab American to voice my frustration, voice my concern, voice my worry post 9/11. But through the friendship of Sergio Perez and the La Raza Law Student Association, I was invited by the Black Law Student Association to be involved with both boards. Both organizations gave me a critical platform and an ability to really present my concerns, my viewpoints, and give face and give voice to the struggle of Arab Americans during that critical moment in the history of the United States at large, but also the experience and the narrative of Arab Americans at that day. And those experiences, as I look back a decade earlier, were very critical in forming the shape and the trajectory of my career, which has been very much based on coalition building and truly building coalitions not along the lines of leaders of several organizations meeting and framing strategy, but really promoting a new brand, a new platform and paradigm for what coalition building is and should mean. And it's really it gifts us that we have Suhaila here today, because coalition building truly takes place and is truly manifested in the community and on a community level, where everyday individuals who seldom have the opportunity to attend conferences like this, and seldom have the opportunity to hear the speeches of organizational leaders, truly execute the kind of coalition building and the true kind of community integration that needs to be had for this country to be united, and also for the interests of civil liberties at large, and the interests of Arab Americans post 9/11 to truly be entrenched and truly be advanced in a meaningful way. So if I can advance, I'd like to address three seminal points, if you will. First, I want to discuss the diversity within the Arab community and how that diversity really lends itself well to true coalition building. The second point I want to address is before true coalition building can be had on part of Arab Americans, how it's really incumbent upon Arab Americans and Arab American leadership to refine and redefine what it means to be Arab American from a legal, political, and ethnic perspective. And finally, I want to address some of our natural allies in promoting the Arab American platform, if you will. But second, how to broaden that base of allies. So first, diversity within the Arab American community. I think if all of us could just look at this wall over here and look at these wonderful portraits that the ADC has showcased, these portraits really illustrate the diversity and kind of the cultural and ethnic and religious mosaic that is the Arab world. And I think one benefit and one natural resource that the Arab world has is its deep and rich diversity. We have individuals who phenotypically look black. We have individuals who look Caucasian. Individuals who can who just manifest a series of different ethnic appearances. We have religious diversity, which is unparalleled. And that diversity lends itself really well to building in-house avenues towards coalition building with organizations that represent various array of constituents. Arab Americans from the continent of Africa, Sudanese Americans, for instance, who may identify as both African and Arab, provide direct, authentic, in-house ambassadors that can build real bridges with the African American community here in the United States. And I think that organizations such as the ADC and other organizations that represent Arab Americans have to really leverage and empower these individuals to build lasting coalitions with these organizations. More so, I think part of the reason that hasn't really been successful in many ways are for two reasons. First of all, one thing that needs to be addressed, and I've written about this issue quite extensively, is racism within the Arab American community, which hasn't been meaningfully addressed and tackled. The second point is there's been somewhat of a hyper-emphasis on the Levant, Egypt, by organizations to the detriment of other regions of the Arab world and other communities in Arab America that have not been given due attention. So that needs to be addressed. Organizations like ADC, AAI, and so forth should really pay more attention, more resources to address what's going on in the Horn of Africa, Northeast Africa and Morocco and so forth, the Gulf. And unless this happens, the ability to encompass and bring in and give true voice and membership to other Arab Americans is not going to be had. I have 2 minutes, so I'm going to rush really quick, and I can address these other points during the question and answer period. But finally, I have a piece that addresses in the handbook you guys have, that addresses Arab American legal identity. And I think that post 9/11, Arab Americans haven't done the necessary work to really refine and solidify what it means to be Arab American. I mean, government classifies us and considers us as white, even though that conflicts with our political and social experience on the ground. We've been othered, we've been marginalized as being anything but white and haven't had access to white privilege. So a lot of work and a lot of energy and a lot of research needs to be had to really finalize and refine what it truly means to be Arab American. I'm going to stop now, but I'd be glad to field any questions you may have about these issues.
Thank you, Khaled. I got a little nervous when you brought up that big clipboard, so hope he still likes me, but just trying to keep things moving. I thought we would have a little bit of discussion amongst the panelists and also with the audience, because I know there's lots of questions and thoughts that you all have. What I thought I would do is just kind of kick off with one issue of discussion before I turn it over to some of our friends in the audience, and that was, we're talking about coalition building, and this is something that we have been engaged in both on a community level, as Suhaila has been, and on a national level, as Margaret has been. And we've had some successes with folks, as has been described by some of the panelists, as natural allies. But going back to what I was saying earlier, if poll after poll demonstrates that we are, in effect, losing the conversation with the American public, if polls after 9/11, September 2001, demonstrated that around 50 to 60% of most Americans, the majority of Americans, realized that the attacks on our country were in fact by a few and not representative of a major faith community, and that their and our friends and neighbors who happen to be Arab or Muslim are in fact Americans like all of us, and those numbers now are down into the 30s. After all the coalition building and all the work that we've done, with all due respect, and I include myself in that effort, where do we need improvement? Who are the others that we need to reach out to? And I would offer, and I want to get your thoughts on this, and that we need to reach out to groups that have demonstrably the most question about who Arabs, who Muslims are, and that those groups tend to be church-going Catholics, evangelical Christians, which together make up more than half the country. And if you look at poll data for those specific communities, those are the groups that have the most questions, or in some cases have the most suspicion about Arabs and Muslims. So I want to ask on a local level, on a national level, what your thoughts are about kind of where we are in coalition building, what you think about maybe expanding our role and our circle and our orbit of those coalitions that we reach out to, and what you think might be some of the negatives and positives on that. Whoever wants to go first, I'll love to hear it.
Well, let me, this doesn't work.
If it doesn't, we can use this
I
one.
don't know if it's working. That wasn't. I know on a community level, immediately post 9/11, I think I spoke at about 36 churches. Mm-hmm. People that reached out to us. In fact, I was in the mall a month after 9/11, and a lady approached me and was asking me some questions, and then asked me if I would come and speak at her church, which was about an hour and a half away from Dearborn. So I said yes. I went. I thought it'd be a small church group. There were 160 women who just we sat and had a very open conversation, allowed them to ask all the questions that they wanted, and from that point on, they actually had called their friends at other churches, and we had started doing that on a where I just grabbed a bunch of friends and said, hey, we're going to have some conversations. And it was something as simple as sitting down with these various communities and churches and talking to them about Islam and about the Arab American community. And though that was something that I would say was done greatly at that point for, I'd say, the first few years post 9/11. Most recently, I know we have a lot of groups coming in. Many groups tend to flock to the Islamic Center of America, where they facilitate trainings, and they do tours of the Islamic Center and give talks about Islam and who Muslim Americans are and whatnot. I think it's something that on a community level you need to be able to reach out to, open your hand and be willing to embrace, your brother or your sister. At the end of the day, we are all Americans, and we are here for the same reason, to better our lives and to move forward and have our families grow up in this great nation. So it's important for us on a community level to reach out to these other organizations and to these other more on the more conservative end, to ensure that they're aware that we are here and we want to work together. It's difficult in coalition building to connect with these groups that don't necessarily want to embrace you. Some of them are very standoffish. Some of them will actually say, we're not interested. But it's just in knowing that you're making that effort on a community level. It's something that's necessary across the board. Even if there's one Muslim living in somewhere in a rural town in Oregon, reaching out to the local church and trying to build that relationship and talk and have a simple conversation can help greatly on a grassroots level.
Margaret or Khaled?
Thanks. I was listening to the discussion with the lunch panel and the conversations around bullying, and the comments were made that the LGBT community has had a lot more success in moving public opinion and getting their concerns out on a broad level than many other groups have been able to do. And I've always thought that one of the reasons for that is that because so many people in the United States know someone who's gay or lesbian or bisexual or one of those categories. So when you know someone, it changes the dynamics. I once sat in on a focus group session where people were trying to assess what kinds of messaging would get more Americans in support of immigration reform. And consistently in all of the focus groups, the people who were willing to hear the messages and supportive of messages were people who knew undocumented immigrants and who thought they were good people and didn't think that they should be facing what they're facing. So knowing somebody personally makes a big difference, and I think the work that you've done is exactly on target. It's going to take that kind of personal outreach and relationship building to make changes. But that's a really long time. I mean, that's a lifetime investment. That's not something that changes quickly. And so I think the other key is in building relationships with groups who may not know enough about our communities, who may not share the experience of our communities, but who can understand and relate to the goals that we have. One of our big targets in our campaign against racial profiling is law enforcement officials. Which is an interesting group to be working with on the campaign. But in fact, having police chiefs go up to Capitol Hill and talk about how incredibly ineffective it is for them to do their jobs when racial profiling is a part of it, that is far more persuasive to a number of communities than me going up and saying the exact same thing. So we have to really think about the messengers and delivering the same comments that we would want to make, but who's going to be heard by people who might not be open to our perspectives.
Thank you. Anything to add, Khaled? Yeah.
Yeah, I think before the work that needs to be done before you actually approach an organization is to truly try to understand, the narrative and try to understand what specific platforms those organizations and those communities are trying to promote themselves. So, for instance, oftentimes organizations approach a potential ally and try to build along lines of, converging issues, racial profiling, for instance. But hypothetically speaking, that organization may not know about or may not, fully appreciate the experience that, let's say, Latino Americans have with racial profiling, and they approach effectively trying to promote their own strategy and their own interests without fully understanding the experience and the experience, but also kind of what the specific strategy and the agenda of that organization they're looking to ally with is also. So that homework needs to be done, I think, before you approach an organization you eventually want to partner up with.
Well, thank you. Well, I want to go ahead and open up to the floor because I know you must have questions of your own. So go ahead and let me know who has a question. Identify yourself, and I really do mean just help me out here. Ask a question. If you want to make a speech, Abid will put you on a panel. Go ahead.
Again, my name is Amal David. When I hear talk shows, I feel that no one is hearing us. Like, as much work as we're doing and you are doing and ADC is doing, I say, it didn't make any dent. What can be done? Because people on the media, those who are conservative and doing talk shows, they reach millions of people. And just, I hear, now I am avoiding all these talk shows because they make me very emotional and very upset. But even the people who call in, just 100% of all of them, they are constantly attacking Arabs and Muslims and putting them in a very, very degrading situation. So your question was, who are the groups to address? I think people who are in the media.
Anybody want to address that?
I think the media game is clearly a ratings game, and the kind of content the media is going to deliver is going to be based on the audience and who the audience is. I think one encouraging trend we have in this country is that this country is quickly becoming a minority country, meaning that people of color in this country will soon be the majority. So I think in terms of strategy, one thing Arab Americans need to do and organizations like ADC really need to do is to partner up with the Latino community, which has the most proliferating population in the country, and other segments of the country that are growing in number. And by virtue of partnering up with populations that are rising, in the long term, you'd hope that that's going to be reflected in not only the media but other halls of power, and that those organizations who are natural allies are going to provide platform to Arab Americans who have a similar political and social experiences such as themselves. So, if I was strategizing the trajectory of an ADC, or for instance, one of my top priorities was to contact the MALDEF, is to contact Latino organizations, and my experience on the West Coast, these are organizations that, by all measure, would want to work with an ADC and would want to work with the Arab American community at large, and African Americans also, and the LGBTQ community also. I think that to identify marginalized communities of all and organizations of all sorts, there's that natural overlap of experience and camaraderie that comes with being marginalized and vilified to an extent that provides for an ideal avenue to build strong and lasting coalitions.
And I would add to that, I've gone on Sean Hannity's show and other shows like that you're probably referencing, and there's no doubt a lot of the language has become much more hostile, much more strident. I think there's a couple of factors there that we need to also examine. The news has changed. When I grew up, at dinner time, the family got together and we would turn on the news and we had three choices: ABC, NBC, CBS, 7 o'clock, half an hour. You watched the news and the next news was the next day at 7 o'clock, or you would read your paper, which you had to wait for the next morning. You would get up and go get the paper on the driveway. Well, now, I don't even know who does that anymore. I mean, you have 24-hour cable news. You can get on your BlackBerry or your Windows phone or your iPod and get news anytime. And what's more interesting, for better or worse, is that now we don't have a shared narrative of news. Now people watch news or read news that reinforces their own worldview. So for some that means Al Jazeera, for others that means MSNBC, for some it means Fox News. And that narrow kind of siloing of news has really, I would argue, in the one way it's made information more democratic. More people are out there blogging and able to get news out into the bloodstream. But on the other hand, it also, with the good of letting everybody in, it's let everybody in, good and bad. And sometimes what is reinforced is very negative and hostile towards Arabs and Muslims. And so I think it's important that we continue to reach out to groups like MALDEF and African American organizations and others, people from the gay and lesbian communities. But I think we also have to go beyond that, because the hostility is coming from different segments of society. And so that means going on a Fox News, even though you may not be comfortable with that, or going on a Rush Limbaugh or a Glenn Beck show. And yeah, you might get some hostile calls, but if you don't, then you're leaving that whole segment of the population to have a certain narrative without reinforcement of a positive narrative. And worse, we all know that within, unfortunately, these media outlets, there are Arabs and Muslims who, for whatever reason, are perfectly willing to sell out the community to say, yes, all Arabs are bad, or all Muslims are bad. And there's a whole cottage industry of anti-Muslim and anti-Arab hate out there, and a segment of that, a cottage industry within the cottage industry, is Arabs and Muslims who unfortunately are happy to use that platform to sell out their friends and neighbors who happen to be Arab and Muslim just so they can get some airtime. And so we have to be out there confronting those people, as uncomfortable as it might be. And that's where I think the community in the next 10 years looking forward, we might have to kind of, again, adjust as to who are we talking to. Are we talking to just our friends, or are we talking to people that have real questions? Are we going to convince everybody? Of course not. But the majority of Americans are fair-minded people. And I think they will respond to a message of fairness, of justice, but we also have to address questions and concerns, including national security, that we, in fact, are part of the solution of keeping our country safe. So just my personal thought, my experience. But again, I want to have discussion. If some people think I'm wrong, I'd love to hear you. Margaret?
Actually, I just wanted to make a point that's not dissimilar from what you said. In the last few years, the Southern Poverty Law Center has been tracking hate groups in the United States. And as you commented earlier, in the last couple of years, the number of hate groups in the United States has grown quite dramatically. So the fact that there's increasing hate crimes and bullying and ill treatment of people in the Muslim and Arab worlds is not uncommon from what's happening in the Latino worlds and in other immigrant communities. So we're seeing this pattern across the country. And I think one of the most critical things to do is to call that speech out. Unfortunately, a lot of the hate groups are not recognized as such. There are groups that are very anti-immigrant who get invited regularly to speak on various talk shows about their views, and they're not trying to present information that's been collected using due research, diligence, and et cetera. It's to support a particular perspective. So I think it's really important that we call out those groups that are engaged in hate speech against other communities, not to tell them they can't use that, because the ACLU would come after me, but I think it's really important that we call it what it is, and that we recognize that it's not only directed at our communities, but it's directed at many communities, and that this is another shared problem that we should be working on together.
Just to, and living in a city that's the hub of, the Arab and Muslim American community in the nation, and the place where every hate monger wants to come and visit and spew their hatred. It gets to a point where our concern is, you don't want to infringe on a person's, constitutional rights, yet when do you draw the line? And where is it enough? When you have people like we were blessed to have Pastor Terry Jones grace his presence upon us, And you have other groups where, you know, it is your right to say what you feel and have that opportunity to express your views, but when you're allowing your views to perpetuate that hate and that fear, to allow bloggers who are putting out their hate, and that's being picked up not just on their website, but is now being copied and put on another blogger's page and another person's Facebook, and people are seeing it all around the world, to allow for things to happen such as what happened in Oslo. This is a problem for us, and we do need to open our eyes and take a deeper look into what is then, where it then becomes a hate crime and can then hurt other communities, because we're facing this problem daily. And we have people who are coming in and protesting and saying, this is my right to do so, yet at the same time we're having this problem where they're expressing their views, which is increasing the hate in the area, and then once they leave and they go back to their community, wherever they may live, they've allowed then for that hate to perpetuate and people to then possibly do something against an Arab or a Muslim when it's, I can speak when it's pertaining to the Dearborn area community. So that's a constant fear that I know on a grassroots level we have, and it's something that's a huge issue for us, that people, if you're afraid to then walk out of your home and walk the streets because so-and-so just left after doing this huge protest, and now it's got people riled up who may want to do something against you, then what? Then a person's rights are now infringed upon because they're not even comfortable walking, down the street in their own neighborhood.
Who has the next question? Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, Anthony, since 9/11, do you find that the diversity of the Arab American and Muslim community has been somewhat overcome? That there are groups that maybe didn't even talk to each other, although or shared the common heritage. Have you found that that's changed since 9/11?
Post 9/11, I know in Metro Detroit, I think there was a more concerted effort for these various communities within the Arab and Chaldean community to embrace one another and tackle these issues head on. Unfortunately, it took that tragedy to bring the community together in a more concerted effort to battle this discrimination that they were facing. People realizing that it didn't matter, unless you were visibly Muslim like myself, nobody knew if you were Muslim or if you were Christian, as Arabs vary in their religious beliefs. So there was that effort to, and that coalition building and bringing groups together to combat discrimination. Though the communities did work together prior to 9/11, I don't think it was as much as they did post 9/11. Whereas now there's umbrella organizations and there's been a lot more work done together. Now they include one another in almost every activity that's being done, no matter which community it's addressing, or if it's an activity pertaining to just the Muslim community, you always find the Christian community is participating and active in some capacity. But it's something that has worked in our favor, and we've come to realize that we are very much alike, as opposed to concentrating on the differences. We've realized our similarities and have come together and working on how to advance the community as a whole.
Good. Next question or comment? Go ahead.
Well, since everybody else not here was asking me a question,
I know, they're all in this one row here.
Well, I guess my question to the panelists, and thank you for coming out and being part of it. Thank you for Abed and ADC. But I guess related to seeing what we've seen since 9/11 and organizations working together and organization forming. And I actually had a friend ask me recently, have I seen what organizations I've been seeing formed post 9/11? What have gotten stronger? Have organizations still been around since then? And a lot has happened. And through the last 10 decades, there's been spikes. There's been a lot of great things happening, and they kind of plateaued a little bit, and kind of ups and downs. And when there is something, a tragedy happens around the world, when something, especially in the Middle East, of course, things, we go out there, we protest, we rally, we get together. And I guess we all knew, I guess in our hearts, that during 9/11, the day it happened, we all felt the sense of urgency that something's got to come together. We're all going to be out there. We're going to go to the churches. We're going to go to the mosque, whatever heritage we're from. We're going to go out there, and whatever faith we're from, we're going to go out and do whatever it takes to kind of share our feelings, share our thoughts, and be out there, be proactive together. But I guess my question is, do you see what the next sense of urgency, day of 9/11, over the last decade, and what's the next? I mean, is it going to, God forbid, another tragedy, but something happen, the next Arab Spring, or something where organizations are going to come closer together, or how are we going to change the perception a little bit more here in the States, in the country?
Tackle that first. Khaled?
I think what's taking place in the region, in the Arab world, with the Arab Spring, and the successful revolutions, the revolutions that are still in place, clearly what's going on in Syria, provide a really ideal opportunity for Arab Americans to, come together along lines of, human rights, and kind of reframing the agenda beyond the domestic agenda. I think that it seems to me that a decade after 9/11, that we're well beyond the 9/11 era, if you will. We've endured the aftermath of 9/11. I feel as if we've experienced the brunt of kind of the civil rights attack and the chilling effect and so forth of 9/11, and now we're entering this new phase, or this new chapter, if you will, for Arab America. And I think that the Arab Spring is kind of dominating that new chapter. And I think that organizations like ADC and allied organizations, base organizations. I mean, I never want to conflate the fact that it's typically conflated Muslims are Arabs and vice versa, whereas we must acknowledge in this country the majority of Arab Americans are in fact Christian. But aside from that, the Arab Spring really provides an ideal opportunity to build along the lines of human rights, promote the rule of law, and through that promotion of the rule of law, like Suhail was saying, to echo that, really build strong alliances with human rights organizations and rule of law organizations beyond the ethnic and the racial lens, just promoting the notion and the body of universal human rights across the board. And I think that's an avenue organizations like ADC and Arab America at large to truly explore.
I know on a grassroots level, it's vital that people get involved, that they're civically active, they're addressing the fact that they have responsibilities. There are civic duties. You have to get out and vote, have your voice heard. We tend to see, I know in Metro Detroit, I don't know, I mean, I can't speak much for other communities and how they are when it comes to organizing, but we are more reactive than proactive. When an issue occurs, it's oh my God, we need to take to the streets. We've faced issues where I know in 2006 during the Lebanon-Israel war, at the time they wanted us to, ask for a permit 30 days in advance. You had to, receive a bill for all of the expenses that you paid for, where in coalition building, we were lucky enough that in 2003, during the Iraq war, that the ACLU, because we had built a relationship with them, had tackled this issue and allowed for us to not have to request a permit 30 days in advance. I mean, by then, the issue's over with and it's been resolved. But what's important is that, people realize that it's not about what's happening right then and there, that you need to be proactive and you need to be involved in every aspect of American life, that you can't just wait for something to happen to, say, oh my God, we need to run with this and pick up the ball and want to demonstrate or rally. It's a concern that we face on a daily basis. We find that the younger generation is more active, more proactive, are getting involved, are more aware of the issues that we need to deal with and are facing. And it's a very important part of life for us. And Sam, I think we all know, we tend to jump the gun only when issues arise, and on a grassroots level, it's vital that people make that concerted effort to be more involved with organizations and the community and the political system to move forward.
Maybe I'll just add quickly. I think it's inevitable that there's going to be another tragedy. I mean, we've had several tragedies since 9/11. So I don't think that we should wait for the next tragedy. I think the message of being proactive is exactly right. There's a number of things happening right now where they might not sound like they directly affect the Arab American community, but they do. There's been a bill introduced in Congress that would require indefinite detention of people who fall into certain immigration categories. So, for example, it could allow for immigration officials to detain people coming in seeking asylum indefinitely without any recourse to a court to hear their case. That's something that affects every community of immigrants in this country. That's something where you could get involved right now, and you could envision how that, if that law passed, how that could affect our communities in different ways. So we should be looking for things to get involved in, to get our communities aware of, educating, bringing in young people, and then let's not wait for the next thing to try to then mobilize people. Let's have them ready by getting them involved now.
I wanted to just echo on the level of engagement just from a personal perspective, because there's nothing more that I know better than my own experience, and that is, I remember again going back to 9/11. Just days after 9/11, there was a report on Fox News that there was a mysterious Muslim man in the White House who had ties to Al-Qaeda. And I remember seeing that and thinking, gosh, who could that be? I thought I knew everybody in the White House. And of course, my brother from California, being the smart aleck that he is, called me and said, I think they're talking about you, And I said, they can't be, but of course they were. And I found out, just as Margaret articulated, one of those now very well-known hate groups out there was the one that had planted that story, and Fox, to their credit, pulled the story once they put it up there, but and they took it off their website. But it was an example for me, as somebody who had been working in politics for up until that time, 10, 12 years, and been here in D.C. for about 5 or 6. It was kind of an eye-opener for me. But I bring that story up because when that attack was made against me and my character and my loyalty to our country, and then subsequently has been made for the last 10 years, by a few of these groups that Margaret articulated as being out there. They're very well-funded, very well-organized groups that go after people in public service, politicians, both on a local level and on a national level. What's kept me alive politically, as it were, was not only my own personal determination, I'm not going to let the bad guys win, but was that I had friends across the political aisle, conservatives, liberals, moderates, Democrats, Republicans, who knew me. And had worked with me, and so when those attacks were levied, I didn't have to defend myself, but they defended me. Congressmen, senators, activists, left, right, and everything in between were the ones who said, this can't stand, this is not right, we know Suhail, and this is not something that we're going to countenance as his friend. So I think from that example, I really draw upon, again, our larger topic of coalition building, that when that next attack occurs, whether it's a tragedy like a Fort Hood or the Christmas Day or whatever it might be, or it's something that's directed towards the community, as we saw where this hateful rhetoric can lead to, as we saw witnessed in Norway, with those American bloggers who have been going out there and really demonizing American Muslims and Arab Americans. It takes one person to take it the next step, and he did that. Breivik did that in Oslo and killed almost 80 people, innocent people. And so my sense is that there's two things. First, we don't want to in any way curtail free speech. It's, again, one of the things that makes our country special, that we do have a First Amendment, both in free practice of our religious faith, but also of free expression. But also that the best way to counter such hateful speech is to have more speech, to respond to that hateful speech with the truth. And in other words, for people to get to know us before those tragedies occur, so that when they occur, we aren't senselessly demonized, and that the vast majority of Americans will say, we know that our friends and neighbors have nothing to do with what happened in New York or in Virginia or in Pennsylvania or wherever it might be, because our friends and neighbors are law-abiding citizens who love our country just as much as we do. So that engagement has to be there, and it has to continue to be there. And what I would argue, it has to be there beyond just our own comfort zone. It has to be with those communities out there that we may not necessarily feel comfortable with. And sometimes it is rough. I remember speaking to a very conservative group, kind of making the case. I was the first and only Muslim speaker to this group, and I was answering very tough questions about Sharia and all these crazy things that people ask about. And afterwards, one of the persons came up to me and said, hey, don't take it so personally. This was during the 2008 election cycle. He said, you know, I wouldn't vote for a Mormon or a Catholic either. And he was just very upfront about that. You know, so that, again, I think that's in the minority, but it's out there. It's just step by step. And so, you know, I don't want people to lose heart. That, you know, we'll just keep plugging away. We have time for one final question before we close up. Well, seeing that, go ahead.
I won't hold the panel up then.
Okay. Well, you kind of gave me a half-hearted, go ahead.
Well, you know, not all Muslims are Arabs, and not all Arabs are Muslims, and this diversity between the two communities is a natural bridge to form coalitions. Going back to an earlier panel's discussion, have you encountered any state or federal agencies cherry-picking, selectively engaging only certain segments of communities that would want to be reached out to, or vice versa? And have you received any pushback in trying to bring other coalitions to the coalition members to the table, which the agencies are engaging in might not draw a connection to?
Who wants to tackle that in 30 seconds or less?
Wow, that was a more complicated question than I thought it was going to be. That's okay. Yes, we have encountered cherry picking. And absolutely there are some groups that are deemed respectable spokespersons on behalf of whichever community they're claiming to represent, whereas others are not. I mean, I think the key is, again, that's where coalition building can be of help. When we host a meeting for our members, all of our members are invited. We don't cherry pick. So if you want to meet with the Rights Working Group, you meet with our membership. And that makes sure that not only diverse voices are at the table, but also that we have people from outside Washington at the table. Our members from around the country are also invited to participate. And we try to make sure we always are bringing those voices to the table in all of the meetings that we do here. It's a pretty simplistic answer, but...
Well, thanks, Margaret. I want to close there, if we could, on that note. So I want to thank Margaret, thank Suhaila, and thank Khaled. Thank all of you, and especially to ADC for hosting this wonderful conference. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, so let me give you my...